Welcome everybody to the, I think, ninth Future of Development, eighth Future of Development seminar. I'm Shanta Devarajan, and Ranil Disanaika at CGD and I jointly run this. And today I'm delighted to introduce good friend Stefan Dercon, who has just published this book, Gambling on Development. And that's the topic, of the seminar. Stefan, for those of you who don't know, is a professor at the Blavatnik School of Government and the Department of Economics at Oxford, former chief economist of the former DFID, and an advisor to the current FCDO, and has been a distinguished scholar and a policy advisor in development for a long time, instrumental in many of the initiatives in development. So it's really a pleasure. And Stefan will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we followed by our two discussants, Naomi Hossain, who's a senior professorial lecturer in international studies. That's a title, actually. And at American University, and Masood, Ahmed, who's the president of the Center for Global Development. So let me turn it over to Stefan.
Thank you very much. I feel a little bit today, I've been talking quite a bit about the book, and some may have heard me talking a little bit about it before, but I've done this quite a lot. This feels very different. This is a bit like as if I've done all my preparations and now I'm appearing in Have I Got Talent? And there's a jury that actually is going to be judged. It doesn't actually make any sense from the kind of, the different perspectives that they bring. And I want to make sure that these different perspectives and these critiques that no doubt will come actually are articulated. So I'm going to try to speak very fast, which usually I don't find very difficult. Through the kind of main arguments, but also in the sense that we're leaving enough time for the discussants to add and where it is. And so let me try to present the main argument of the book here. So, the starting point for me is in a very simple way. Look, this is a world that has made quite a lot of progress in extreme poverty. Okay, so since 2000, since 1990, in fact, the decreasing extreme poverty, you can question all the data and whatever it is, but these trends in different indicators are definitely true. Is that we got, and the red thing is the number of extreme poor people in East Asia, and we see that there's dramatic declines there. In orange, South Asia. We also see that since about 2000, 2005, declines are happening. Endless debates on the nature of the data from India, but it is somehow happening there in terms of declines. And then the blue one is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that somehow or another seems to, at least on the most extreme forms of deprivation, seems to be stuck. Just as a point of heterogeneity, there's differences that are happening across the world, and the kind of progress in extreme poverty. We then also get not just sub-Saharan Africa as a country, as if it's all the same. As if it's all the same in terms of evolution. If you look at and you start looking, Africa have lots of small countries, but those countries that had about 20% extreme poverty in 1990, this is about 18 countries with more than 8 million population. There's actually 2 of them that managed to halve it, and then a set of them that managed to double it. That's heterogeneity, again, even in the continent, which is sometimes forgotten. Africa is not a country. There's actually lots of different things that happen. And we get there that in all the predictions that we have by 2030, whatever indicators we use, countries like DRC and Nigeria are probably still going to be in a mess, and Madagascar as well. And so this is the kind of thing we have, this kind of differentiation. When we look at growth, I'm not going to deeply into it, you get these same stories, but you also begin to get even in the Asian context, of course, heterogeneity. You get China doing something extremely well, Indonesia doing this, I think by now, almost 50 years, except for around the Asian crisis in 1797, 50 years of about 3.5% per capita growth, apparently, or something like that. And then you get India doing quite well, Vietnam. You get a Bangladesh that was famously called by Henry Kissinger a basket case around 1981, but actually where you kind of saw, actually, no, it actually has progressed quite a lot in economic growth. You get Ethiopia doing that also since about 2005, and then the DRC being stagnant. Nigeria, by the way, the only way we see some increases in something is two factors. It follows entirely oil prices, and on top of that, I remember well the revision of the national accounts in Nigeria when I was talking to the head of statistics in Nigeria, and I asked him, did you get any instructions from the president? And he said, not only that I had to have a bigger economy than South Africa, that was the only instruction, which of course helps to explain a little jump, particularly here, and so on. But you get basically countries that make progress, and there's some unlikely ones, so places like Bangladesh. If you look at Bangladesh, I'm sure Naomi will say more about it if she chooses so in comments, but Bangladesh is this quite remarkable place that she studies so deeply in terms of progress, despite actually a bit of a surprise, call it a development surprise for some, maybe not a surprise for others. It's actually a debated word as well, is it a surprise or not? But it happened, something happened, and indicators improved dramatically in all kinds of ways. So the question I want to ask very quickly is a classic one. You know, it seems to be if you want to write a book for a general public, you better actually ask this question. You know, the bigger question, why it's doing it. But this is a fascinating question. And I definitely felt that these authors that I read, you could have a little pub quiz trying to actually recognize who they are, but I'm sure they've all passed CBD at some point to give a talk, and many of them may have done future development talks as well. They all have their views and they're all the way in it. But probably what they have in common, maybe, okay, I might have said in terms of really questioning what development is per se, but the others all probably say all the things that you should do and shouldn't do, what to do, what not to do. And that's a bit like in all these books, you know, they call it the canon of popular development economics. This is not the best books in the world, but it's the canon of the popular ones, the ones that still sell, the one that seem to be still selling today on Amazon. Not that I have much reason to check it, but it does surprise me actually that occasionally say, well, we're still surviving that stuff. Anyway, but look, we live in hope. But you know, what to do and what not to do is the kind of main thing. And so you get very much, at least in the institution I was working in, Deputy in Aid Agency, you know, center-right government since I actually joined, it was always a bit like that. Not surprising that they loved Asimov Robinson, Why Nations Fail, and that we were clearly told, you know, we're going to do that, that's what we're going to do, because, you know, not least if you read Why Nations Fail, Britain comes out quite well. That always helps if you work in Britain. And basically, Britain in its offshoots like the US, they do seem to be doing well, and all the rest more or less do badly. And so it's a bit like the message that we have sometimes interpreted in the aid world. They say, oh, we're going to build institutions. No, that's actually not what the evidence tells you, what that literature tells you. That tells you something in the 19th century, in the 18th century is predictive of where they are now. And basically, if you read Dr. Snow, this is about historically shaped institutions, slow evolution of norms, values, rules of the game, and so on. And not something you come in with a little mission and we're going to sort your corruption out now or something. That's not the way we did it. And the problem is, when I was chief economist, I was actually, they tell me I need to do that as a framework. And basically, I remember thinking, going into countries, what shall I now tell Nigeria? Get yourself a better history, and should you basically get yourself, you know, better history? And coming from the Brits, that's probably not a very welcome advice. So you get that kind of thing, and I think that's the unsatisfactory part of a lot of that agenda. And not least, on top of that, when you then start looking at the countries that seem to have been doing well, like the countries I was studying, like bits of China, Indonesia, also India, and definitely Bangladesh, and Ghana, and Ethiopia's, they didn't have that recipe sorted that Douglas North or wanted us to have sorted. They were not part of that 34 with the perfect institutions that it's sometimes seen with the open access orders and all the rest was crap. No, they were not, and they still started doing something. Now, I'm not trying to make an argument here whether China will ever reach the US level of standard of living, whether you need all these things in due course, but I wanted to make an argument on takeoff. And you come back to is saying, well, actually, what would be the policies? And if you now read stuff that actually, and I always enjoyed reading it, and at least the implications and that one line from it, which is like, the Growth Commission. I'm sure you wrote a background paper for Shanta at some point, and everybody there, the Growth Commission in 2007, it was an interesting exercise. Because in the end, the conclusion is what got countries to grow more than 7% for at least 30 years actually feels like trivial stuff. Yeah, sure, you need to have at some point macroeconomic stability, a bit of infrastructure. You need to clearly pay attention to education. You need to do something on your nutrition. You need to do certain things. Yeah, right. But then in practice, you can overvalue exchange should maybe not too long, and then you can actually, you can have a fixed or a flexible. You get anything goes in the countries that are successful. Not that's actually totally wrong, I said. Not anything goes, but actually it's quite unconstrained. A lot of it doesn't go, but there is somehow a broader set of what you can get. Now, if it is actually not anymore that narrow, not anymore that kind of 90s, what then other people ended up calling, say, Washington consensus or whatever, narrow set of things you exactly have to do. If there's no recipe, but only we know some ingredients, you have to ask yourself, well, why don't countries do that? And the question I want to ask is, why don't they do it? Or as someone said on one of the talks, what can we say about the don't give a damn countries? The ones that actually don't seem to give a damn and actually not much is changing. Now, that's all dichotomist, simplistic, and so on, and I'll recognize it entirely. But for the sake of argument, there is something there. And for me, it was always brought home best when I visited countries, and this is still some of my best visits was in the DRC, because it was so interesting to just see what was going on. Of course, I spent a lot of time in Ethiopia. It's very striking, of course, that in the DRC, they were quite happy for us to take a photograph of the Prime Minister's office. And in Ethiopia, telling a little bit of the kind of regime this was about 2012, 13, that I was meeting with the Prime Minister. No way I could take a photograph. These are very different regimes, and some care more about certain things than others. But the interesting thing was going to the DRC and sitting in a room and having all kinds of sharp-suited young men giving you the development plan on behalf of Minister Fonyo, the Prime Minister, actually telling you what to do. And they presented this plan, and it was brilliant, World Bank, whoever consultants helped them to do it, and if they did it themselves, brilliant. They've got excellent plans. As an academic, I say, well, actually, this is reasonably well evidence-based. As a kind of best practice and more policy sense, it makes sense. These are the kind of things we would like to see in DRC. And I remember walking out of the room, and my Congolese governance advisor from the embassy, from the UK embassy, said to me, "Quel spectacle! What a spectacle! What a spectacle! What a piece of theater we have seen here." Meanwhile, a few months later, we go to Ethiopia, and we're there, and it was a bunch of invited experts were asked by the Prime Minister's office. I had organized it by my DEFED to actually talk about and brainstorm about their new plans, development plans, it was about 2013 or something, what they were going to do. And we get Justin Lin there, we get Paul Collier there, we get Nan Pritchard there, let's call it different views, different ways of things, very interesting kind of conversations and so on. The Ethiopians were very interested, they presented the plans. Of course, everybody had different ideas about it. What we all agreed amongst the outsiders afterwards saying, some tricky things, definitely sailing close to the wind from the macro, not sure this is going to be able to be delivered. But we all walked out, and actually, whether it was Justin or Lant or Paul, is saying they're going to do this, isn't it? And it probably may well be successful. And in fact, it became one of the fastest growing economies in the world in that 10-decade period. And you can ask the question what it is. But that was very different. And it actually tells me, within that kind of set of recipes, there is not that obvious thing, that clear sense, but it actually has something to do with something quite different. And this is what I want to allude to. And I know I rely a bit on special and violence and social order, not necessarily for the conclusions and the way they do it, but the way to frame it. Just there to look at the state as somehow a solution to violence. The state is somehow, like Max Weber said, trying to get monopoly of legitimate use of violence as a characteristic of an emerging state. And basically you have you deal with that by having a coalition of those who could be violent, but actually chose not to do because they have a deal over the control of resources and so on. Of course, this is what I call the elite, people with power and influence that can actually share it. And I don't simply want to say, as in Douglas North, this is how states emerge. Most states keep some of these features. The example I love giving, and I know people in Britain at times, is saying if I was basically someone who happened to be carrying the sword of a Norman knight in 1066, there's a pretty good chance I'm still a millionaire today. Okay, so this kind of inheritance rights, property rights we all love, but inheritance rights that come with it, they do create a sense of who controls resources and who doesn't. And so we just have to admit to that. That's part of the system. We still do a rent distribution in society here, where we not say that we still say, well, the children can keep the wealth of the parents up to a point. And so we do that. So every society has its rules, it access rules to resources, and so we have this stuff. So I like to think therefore about purely simplistically in terms of simplifying the way to think about it, around an elite bargain is present. Basically, who are the elite? Is those people with power and influence. I think that's basically any state has that one way or another, or at least any state with a certain stability tends to have a bargain. Sometimes the equilibrium can be a bit more stable than others. At the minimum, it's a coalition for peace and stability, and from then onwards, it can look in various ways. But it typically involves somehow who controls the state, and it involves also who has access to resources and distribution. Okay, so when political scientists will talk about that describes political settlement. I know it's sometimes different and somehow, but it's same type of inspiration as the literature and elite bargain and the political economy has. And somehow that's there. So it's there. Now we could have lots of them. I could basically build up a state that is fundamentally giving rewards for those people who supported me to get power. Can be a clientelist state. I can do a kleptocratic state, like Mobutu Sese Seko was very good at trying to do, at least, of course, until there was nothing to loot anymore, which is basically, it's just stealing whatever you can and create incentives, as he famously said to his civil servants. Yes, I know people are complaining about corruption, but but if you have to steal, please steal a little and leave something for the next person. And that's the advice to the civil service in that kind of setup. You get these things. I simply want to make a point, and I'm going to make simply the point and not to say massive amounts about it. You clearly need somehow in that lead bargaining and commitments for growth and development, or you won't see it. Or put it as an economist, I would say, don't forget that the objective function matters. And later on with development assistance, you better understand the objective function of those you do. Because otherwise, it's not going to be done. It can't be just words, and I can be criticized on this categorization. It's basically, it needs to be credible that the peace and stability is there, that actually there is a possibility of progress. So you can't just all the time have disruption and so on in it. The state just knows what it can do and can't do. The Bangladesh state could not do what China did. 2,000 years of meritocracy, bureaucracy, 2,000 years of centralized taxation gives you some opportunities for China to do certain ways of state-led development. Malawi doesn't have that, Ghana doesn't have that, Bangladesh doesn't have that either. And you need to find a way to actually do it in a way that can work for your society. That's the self-awareness. And surely you need to learn because you'll make errors. You need to be bureaucratically or politically find a way of doing it. Links back to accountability. Let me not say too much about it so that others can do it. But basically, I would say, before we get to the kind of the list of things they should be doing, which again, I say, it's probably a bit broader than we usually advise from an advisory capacity, we better have that commitment first. And it leads to it. It's not simply market of the state. It's not simply perfect institutions. Yuan Ang says this beautifully about China, where she really says, look, don't forget that in 79, institutions in China were really weak, and they have been weakened through lots of strife and conflict after the Cultural Revolution and so on. Basically, I want to briefly say it is a gamble. And the gamble is basically because the status quo for the elite is very attractive. And that's when people now will criticize me, and I'm sure I will, where are the people here? But for me, it is the point of it. It's like, we too quickly often in our community thinking about development, say, oh, it just will all be solved by the people. Credits to sector people, it will all come. We can do, and I've done it as DFID, signed off for it for many years, endless civil society operations in Nigeria, and endless transparency initiatives. But basically, if you have a don't give a damn government, there's nothing. And we've done this forever. All these transparency initiatives, publishing all the kind of things. it needs a bit of a demand there as well. So in Ghana, it works reasonably well. In Kenya, we have some good examples. In Nigeria, it doesn't work. The elite can stop things. That's the power of the elite. And the elite also has an incentive not to change, because that gives certainty. So it's the gamble, if you open up, like Suharto did for foreign capital in the 1970s, as Ethiopia also started gambling, taking not just control, but having economic forces that arguably, you could argue in Ethiopia, because people saw growth, actually you got contestation as well around the rents, and that actually destabilized the equilibrium. It's a gamble for those who hold power. That's why I focus on the elite to start with, but that's that. Anyway, can't be just words, but actions and behavior. Since it's about agency, not structures, it's about agency and actions, not about history. I find it much harder to get my data set to go and buy cross-country regressions, because it is about actions and behaviors that I need to find a way of identifying. And every time the question, when I was talking to people from the Hill, I said, well, how can we now measure this? I say, that's the right question. But you have to be willing to actually have a bit more understanding of where you're working, rather than just, oh, I can have a quick scorecard and MCC will do forever and excellent work. So you can't quite just do this. Anyway, countries that are there, let me not talk too much about it, but the countries that I think Nigeria I mentioned already, Kenya, for example, I find it's an interesting thing, because since 2007, it found a way to overcome the biggest obstacle to the underlying stability in its society around the economy, which is basically constitutional reform after the violence, and it managed to get the first step. I call it decentralized its corruption. That's always helpful, because it was, the winner takes all kind of stuff in the election system that we had. Now, actually, it's decentralized. If you don't win the capital, you can win a little bit lower as well. But in a rent-seeking society where it is very clientelist and so on, that actually provides some stability in the rents that allows a bit to do it. And so Kenya, I find interesting, not least that we now got someone elected that appears to be more on outcomes than actually on delivering some of the outcomes rather than just rents. And now we have Ethiopia, I mentioned it. I think that was an interesting thing. It was a development bargain. You may not like all the features of it in around 2005, but actually, it was a political deal that was fragile, because it was controlled by one ethnic group with all the others there, a little bit as secondary players. Meles Zenawi gambled on development as a source of legitimacy. And you got it. In Ghana, probably in the 1990s, we managed to coming out of the military regime. Jerry Rawlings, instrumental of forcing a constitution to be written that actually is constraining what party politics can look like, meaning that parties have to represent the different regions and ethnicities. With that constraint, the political elite has been willing to operate and doing transfers of power. A bit in a mess now, but actually for many years, transfers of power creating actually quite good growth. And Bangladesh, in some sense, in that period, you get in the 1980s, the emergence coming out of conflict and difficulties in the 1970s. I was in Bangladesh and found fascinating that everybody recognized a new elite bargaining around development appeared to have emerged in the 1980s or so. And everybody disagreed when it was and what the fact was. And you will recognize that people also criticize, and now we have some of the explanations. Other people say, no, it was then. And actually, interestingly, as I said, it wasn't the state was self-aware enough not to try to take it on everything. Now that was really interesting. It didn't try to take everything on, but the people said it didn't mean it didn't take good policies. So and actually, one person started listing all the policies that were really instrumental, and they were interesting. Was the Denationalization Act, where the fertilizer market liberalization, and where something to do with the central bank that they were actually a bit more sensible. Now, I'm not saying liberalization, everything is the right thing, but there was a sense that the controls and the rents that was being created probably were detrimental, and a recognition that maybe we shouldn't do everything. And of course, the best example for me is always, which country in the world would allow its social sectors in that period, or the most effective part of social sectors be run by BRAC, by an NGO. India would never allow an NGO to become as big. And so that's the self-awareness of the state I want to lead. What can outsiders do? I'm finishing it. Well, we could do this. We could go to New York and stand on a picture. We could all go and stand together and say, hooray, hooray, this is the shared commitment for growth and development that we have. This is the Millennium Declaration picture. you know, and when I wrote the book, I was interesting. It's Creative Commons, so I wasn't glad to put a picture in my book. I don't know. Anyway, but and I didn't even at the time realize that having Vladimir Putin on there was possibly an area, an issue there. But basically, you know, the countries that want development in their way, their own way, and I very much want to be liberal in thinking what should be allowed to be done. They don't need the photo opportunity in New York to be actually on a picture there with a signature on a Millennium Declaration. They don't need the MDGs or the ESG because they actually, kind of broadly speaking, want to do it. But this is a great opportunity for all these people who are the crooks of the world to actually be on a photograph with all these ladies and seemingly that they're all just the same as all the others. So you have plenty of people that are indicted in the International Court of Justice. You have plenty of people that are in jail. There are plenty of people that waged massive wars against their own people and so on that same picture. They've all signed the SDGs. Okay, and that's actually legitimizing that is probably not happening. But what you then say, well, I think we should, on the one hand, be much more willing to be liberal with it and thinking broader what we want to do, and on the other hand, being much more careful. And basically, countries where, with all the difficulties we have, where there seems to be a development bargaining emerging, looking at the clock now, and we'll finish in a moment, where it's emerging, where broadly speaking, put it for those of the economists here, there is no principal agent problem because the principal and the agent wants the same thing. We have shared objectives. We have a shared objective. Well, why would we then start doing endless stuff like payment by results and endless type of, oh, sorry, CBD like that. But you know, why should we do it? We should go back to what we actually at some point worked quite well in these places, just support them. Work with the governments, do it, their plans, not ours, you know, give them ownership, give them all the things. But ownership only gets you to so far, you know. When you get onto the Hossain Declaration and so on, all talking about ownership. In countries without a development bargain, you may want to ask yourself, but who actually owns the country? And actually is this small group that doesn't really want any good with the place. Well, that aid, what's the point of aid? And actually aid risks creating more trouble. So you have on the one hand, you should be much more generous compared to what my institution was doing in London. And on the other hand, you should actually just have your eyes open. Just program your money based on needs is definitely the last thing you want to do. I think my boss was very much in favor for it, but you know, I respect that, but it definitely is not the way to get effective. Because you may think that, look, I'm doing good. I was at UN for executive director and now senior management. And of course, lots of people were saying it, look, there's children there that are malnourished. Are we going to not do this? No, the problem is that with us doing good, we may risk embedding that elite bargains as well. Nigeria, health, endless amount of resources spent. It's still one of the countries, probably it spends the lowest share of its budget on health. So basically, we as the UK, every year, 200-300 million pounds giving of aid over 10 years or so until about 2020. You know, massive amounts of aid, lots of it in health, compensating for an elite that couldn't give a damn. Indicators improve a bit, but actually, basically, we're embedding the elite because, oh, it looks not too bad and doing it. Let me not start about Malawi now. But that's basically these kind of places. And we should actually have the honesty, not call that stuff development. We're not changing anything. We do good. We do charity, and we go with charity, it can create all kinds of issues as well, because it gives excuses for those who should be acting that they don't act. So that's what we should be conscious about. So finally, what should we do? Internationally, you know, CGT stands for lots of global public goods. I think actually, interestingly, you know, the more I was looking at it, we know, for example, that East Asian countries and others, exporting was a big part of it, open as well. And we have a very good economic explanation for that, but it's actually pushing to the frontier linked to it as well. But it creates great incentives in the economy, like it was in Bangladesh, for actually keeping the export orientation. So you avoid the exchange rate to be actually excessively overvalued. And we avoid this kind of things. I find it very striking this time in that, and I was trying to spot it. How many Mercedeses do I see? It's very few. How many do I see in Nigeria? That only Mercedes citizens, so to speak. And that's the difference. So you kind of get a political economy thing that the right forces get encouraged as well, and that actually gets in the elite there as well. Interestingly, of course, I'm not saying trade is dead, but it worries a bit that trade is partially dead. Having said that, I think the Bangladeshis of the world, when I was talking to firms there, they know, and they're now actively trying to get Samsung to do semiconductor chips and so on, because this is their window now, because China needs to looseness. So it's not that entirely. There's lots of places that could take advantage. And that's a big moment still there. But the other one is, of course, illicit finance. I don't like, I like Superman's book, but I don't like the focus on tax. It's not about tax illicit finance. Sorry. That's our view. I never want to give Kabila or Buhari more money. That's the last thing I want to do, actually, to give Buhari and Kabila more money, the DSC in Nigeria. It's all about understanding how politics is financed. And illicit finance is the big facilitator of political finance for an odious regime. And that's actually where we should do it. Now we have a massive opportunity because we are a country of rule of law in Britain. It's so amusing. For 15 years, we've been pushing for laws on Ukraine. We are meant to be a country of rule of law. The International Crime Bill never put through. Now probably it's going to come through very quickly. Basically meaning illicit finance, because we need to have somehow the law backing us when we go after the yachts of the oligarchs. But suddenly, as a civil servant, I'm telling all the civil servants, this is your chance. Because now it's the moment you shame your minister and saying the law says that this is now illegal as well. Can we go after Buhari's cronies and all the things much more actively? This is your moment. And I think in the next 10 years, I think that's our big chance, because a lot of it can be cleaned up, because actually the laws have improved quite a lot compared to what they were. So other things in country, I'm still doing this again. I think it's that's fine. And once we're in the country, look, I'm giving this very annoying point that everybody hates in headquarters. Context matters. Which now can do things. Can't I have simply saying just do everything on climate or everything on that? That's so much easier. No, context matters. If you want effectiveness, you need to understand what's going on. If you want effectiveness, you need to think about it. You may actually have to be aware that you shift to lead bargains by the present. This is all very public. Let's not name names. Let's say an unnamed person at the IMF. I had an excellent conversation with, and yesterday I had an open discussion on IMF Live, and he kind of kindly asked me, can you say it, because I can't. But certain things, which is basically you have to be aware that, for example, sometimes macroeconomic stability is actually also in the interest of the elite. Keep the exchange rate there. So IMF stability and no growth is actually not necessarily the right incentive. And so you need to recognize that actually, if we push this too hard, we're risking elites capture as well in another way, because elites like stability, they like the status quo. And so, you have to understand that Latin America gets often mentioned in that respect as well. Anyway, we may do certain things, but of course, very cautiously. I was accused in one talk and saying, are you proposing that we all should become a bit like the CIA and basically getting regime change? My answer is, we are not the CIA, but we actually are shifting elite bargains all the time. Maybe we should think a little bit about it, that they actually the good ones. And so do it. So my fears involved geopolitical focus. Since I write the book, suddenly we get all that stuff. We're going to have more crooks are left of the hook because they are our crooks. And I always think that's what we did with Mobutu, and I fear we're going to create more Mobutus. That's my big worry. My hope is that if you look at it, or I sort of dropped the letter S there at the end, but many countries shifted. They began to shift at the end of a crisis. Not everybody, of course, most crises end in most conflict ends in more conflict. But it is that window there, where there is a moment typically in society amongst the elite as well. Is it time to actually shift the expectations? And then finally, for me, the most important GPG for development in the poorest places, for the Congos and the Nigeria, is the illicit finance.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Now let me turn to Naomi Hossain for her comments.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Stefan. It's really great to see your performance and hear you perform it. Having read the book, I did love the book, and I should tell everyone here that the reason I think Stefan invited me here was that I was a bit rude on Twitter. And
yes.
I said, oh, another economist teaching us about politics. And politics and development is replete with economists telling us what we should think. And yet, I think it's a great book. And I think I said also, though, when I was really nicer, I think it's a bit of a game changer. partly because you are an economist. And what I really loved about the book was the biographical elements, you know, of this white Belgian, European economist from, you know, degrees from all the top universities, I imagine, going around the world and gradually having these Damascene moments when he realizes that he's got all these technical tools and these great ideas, and actually, if the politics aren't right, then all bets are off. So it's a really great book from that point of view. I really love that. And I think that, you know, anyone who is going to the field, taking, you know, starting a mission, joining the aid services, joining the bank or the fund or whatever it is, if they don't go off with a copy of this book, I'll be very surprised. So hopefully you'll be, you know, making your enter in that way. But also I think for the general reader, I think it's really captured very nicely in these nutshell accounts of the political development and the economic development of some very complicated stories, let's face it. I think you really capture the essence of those bargains or those moments very well, the crisis moments as well. So I loved all of that. I think it's very, very, you write so well, and you're an economist. I mean, some of my best friends are economists, but I'd never say they write that. So this was really
Had a
great.
good editor.
Okay. It wasn't actually you read those first. But it does have a slight feeling of DFID 2005. And this worried me a bit because, you know, one of the things that were present in DFID 2005, an aid agency that was very committed really to a kind of strong political understanding and of intervening in ways that was actually very constructive from the point of view of development and accountability and pro-poor development in particular. I mean, we just don't have that government in Britain anymore, and the aid agency also has been weakened significantly. So these are, you know, that's kind of sad. The three things I really wanted to say to you about the book that I think are worth talking about more, worth interrogating more, are first, are these actually bargains what you're thinking about? And I know you're an economist and there's the game theoretic approach and so on, but in the institutionalists, I think, obviously talk much more about contracts. We talk about social contracts, of course, in political theory, political science, but in development, I think they've never really, social contracts have never really had a big part of the discussion for many different reasons. But I think the language that I try to use in my work on Bangladesh is more consensus. I think an elite consensus is it is, as a concept, has to do rather less hard work than bargain. So one thing I missed a little bit in your book was evidence that these were bargains other than the fact that they sustained over time. There's no sense in which they're being policed. One or two of them, you can see the mechanics of the bargain being formed. I think Somaliland and Ethiopia, I think you show those. But in others, it has the effect of a bargain, but maybe is not necessarily a bargain. And certainly in Bangladesh in the 1970s, I wouldn't have said there was a bargain. I would say that there was a weaker party which disagreed, and a dominant party that held together an elite faction that really did agree in pursuing growth and development. And I think this is one area of research I think I wish you had engaged with more was the effective states inclusive development work, because their political settlement work on different kinds of political settlements, the different kinds of elite deals that exist, would say that when you have a dominant force, Chinese Communist Party, the EPRF, whoever they are, they have long time horizons. They don't really need to bargain with anyone because they're in power and no one's going to shove them out. And this is what we've been seeing in Bangladesh, in fact, since about 2009 as well. A quite comfortably seated government with a large mandate, and they've been doing all sorts of things. So I'd say definitely that concept, I think, wants to be interrogated. The other thing that I was very interested in is the aims of this bargain. And I think there's a little bit of teleology here, in the sense that you looked for cases with high growth and development, and then you saw in the actions of the elite a move towards growth and development. And the case I know very well of Bangladesh, I would say at the time when they were creating some kind of consensus, it actually wasn't really around high growth. I think they couldn't see that far away. At that time, it was such a bad crisis moment, 70s. We had the massive cyclone, we had the war, mass rapes and so on, the famine. And we had all of these disasters in a row. Nobody was thinking about growth. Nobody was thinking about going into guns. And in fact, neoliberalism hardly even started at that time. Nobody was thinking about export manufacturing in the way that they were in the 80s. What they were thinking about was, let's survive. let's make sure our people can be fed, and let's put in place the mechanics to protect them against disaster. And I think this really has sustained Bangladesh in a big way. And I think as the rest of the world discovers climate change and its effects, they will be looking at Bangladesh to see what did they actually do? How did the politics end up as a kind of what Alex de Waal used to call an anti-famine social contract? I think in Bangladesh, it's an anti-famine and anti-disaster social contract that we have developed. And that for me was the foundations of the growth bargain that came later. And it's also, I think, when I look at these countries, I think about Sierra Leone, I think about Afghanistan, DRC, any of these. I think really if I were the peace builder in charge, the development wallah in charge, I would say first thing, let's make sure everyone's eating. If once you've got everyone eating and nobody's worried that they're going to be wiped out in the next storm, then we can talk about some other stuff. So I would think that the aims of the development bargain, want to be interrogated a bit more. I would say also Vietnam was probably a similar case to that. I think, there's a lot to be said about the trauma and the violence that came with those crises that you mentioned, like for instance, Indonesia. And you slightly blithely dismissed what was essentially a massacre of 1 million leftists. I mean, they wiped out the left. There was no left to contend with any market-oriented policies. I think that's important. Some of these crises are so traumatic, it's not surprised that elites said, okay, you know what? This is too much for anyone. My third point really, and I would love to talk to you more about NGOs in Bangladesh, but that's perhaps a discussion for another time. But the role of donors in powerful countries, and I was so pleased to see that you ended this discussion about the global the illicit finance business. A couple of times in the book you mentioned impunity as a really critical problem, critical barrier to the creation of viable development bargains, pro-poor development bargains. It's so true. Impunity is the opposite of accountability. I work in the Accountability Research Center in American University, and this is all we think about. And impunity, again and again, this is the thing we have to remove, it has to be removed. And in this sense, I think, again, I wish you had engaged a bit more with the effective states inclusive development work, Sam Hickey and his friends, Kunal Sen, and so on. Because when they talk about political settlements, they explicitly include the North. They explicitly include transnational actors, including aid donors. It's not that aid donors can pick and choose whether to get involved. They're always involved. They're always already involved. They're part of the political settlement, whether they like it or not. It's not that they have a choice in that. But I think we make that very clear in Afghanistan, the terrible disaster that was wrought on Afghanistan. Yeah, that's my last point. But I think that when I thought your questions about whether you've got a bargain or not equally apply to donors, you could say about donors, do they actually have consensus amongst themselves, or are they in competition? Often I think it's countries with lots of resources. I look at Mozambique right now, in the way all of the big powers are getting in there to have a chunk of the energy that's being generated there, or will soon be generated there. Are these donors cooperating with each other, or are they competing? Is pro-poor inclusive development actually something that donors want in the country? I think it's very interesting that it's Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Rwanda are all countries where we've had these pro-poor development bargains, and they're all countries in which the international community had no interest in doing anything else. These are countries that by the time that they were making their bargains had no geopolitical significance except to show pathways to development. So I think that's really important. I think that's a crucial part of it. I think the North has real interests in these countries, often around energy and other resources. And I think not taking those into account means that we fail to see really what the roots of the bargain are, and also where the roots of the impunity roots in the but congratulations, a wonderful book. I hope you make loads of money, and I hope your book is on the bestseller list on Amazon in the years.
Thank you very much, Naomi. Masood.
Thank you very much. Picking up on some of the points that you mentioned, I also thought that it was actually a consequential book in the stream of books. So you had that picture, Stefan, remember, of all the books. I think 5 years from now, somebody else does a version of that picture. They'll definitely have this picture of this book as well there, because I think what it does is that in a structured way, it introduces a dimension into thinking about what brings about the development of countries and societies that probably, a fair number of people had some abstract notion that it mattered, but hadn't really thought about it. So I think, people thought, as you have done in your little history there, capital mattered, and it was about policies mattered, and it was about institutions mattered. And what you've now said is that actually what really matters is whether the people who have authority and power, the elite in the country, want to bring about the kind of development progress that will affect the majority of people and can see beyond the short term in terms of the negative consequences it might have on their relative power or their relative wealth or their relative standing, to see to the long term and commit to it. And then you articulate and document how that has happened in some countries. And I don't see it myself as a negation of either institutions or policies. Yeah, and I think you're not saying that, although sometimes I think people hear that, and I think the problem with our hearing, probably, but because at the end of the day, in India 1990, you could argue, there was a crisis. There was probably a new elite bargain that said we have to get out, not have this happen again. And you could say Korea, after the crisis that they had, the financial crisis, late 90s, there was a sense that never again do we want to get into it. But the things that they did were actually to put in place good policy. So I think I agree with you that the range of policies is not quite as narrow as some people might say. It's also 1980s version of caricature, pre-Washington consensus, Washington consensus. But it's not unlimited either. Because and that brings me a bit to my second point, which is when you look at the big problem will be in real time identifying what is a bargain. In retrospect, it's a nice way of explaining turnaround. But today, if you were going around to countries saying, is this the making of a development bargain? Should I treat my engagement in a way that this country has embarked on such kind of elite consensus? How would you define that? You could talk to people as you did. Some people talk a very good line, as you discovered. But in the end, you sort of look and see what are they doing, not just what do they say, but like what actions are they taking? And that kind of brings you back a bit to policy. Like, are they actually taking those actions that you think would be reflective of an elite that had struck that kind of bargain? So I think there's a little bit of an identification problem, in terms of real-time argument. And then the other thing I wanted to say, to be sure that I don't overrun my time, is the vast majority of the world at any given time is going to have an imperfect bargain. Okay? You might run into a few country cases at the right time where you sort of walk in and say, wow, this is, there's an elite that's committed, they sort of have a reasonable sense of the policies. There was some sense of institutional framework that worked, but most times it'll be imperfect and sometimes non-existent. And then the question becomes, what do you do? And there, I think it's both true and not very helpful to say that if the context is bad, almost any good you attempt to do could have some spillover negative effects. And essentially your argument is, macro stability in a situation like that could be entrenching the elite, trying to help people with education or health. You sort of are condoning the misallocation of public resources. Nigeria doesn't have as much pressure to allocate. I have two problems with that line of thinking. One is the alternatives. What is the counterfactual? Let's have macro instability, because it might actually bring about a revolution. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. The more likely case is a lot of poor people are going to get hurt along the way. Same thing, let's stop educating these kids and giving them any kind of health services, because it might create some kind of social order. Maybe the Nigerians will. So I think there's an immediate cost which might be a little less. I would be a little careful before going down that road. And the second problem I have is that there is a little bit of a maybe overestimation of our ability to shift elite positions by doing those things. That in some ways, if we were to hold back aid, this would change countries. I think more likely outcome is that actually countries put on the tube for a bit longer, for some internal, for the very same reasons that you outlined at the beginning of the book. These changes come mostly from within, rather than from without. So I think that's the final point that I want to make is that I just want to reinforce the point that I think you end with, which is I don't think the development community. This is Ranil has made this point as well very strongly, is that I don't think the development community has sufficiently internalized this, that probably the biggest way you can change what is the elite bargain in countries is by changing the rates of return of behavior in a secular way by shifting the international environment around them. So in other words, if you deal with IP rules, or if you deal with illicit capital flows, or if you make it harder to score. So if you raise the cost of doing the wrong thing, and if you increase the return on doing the right thing, making exports actually pay off, rather than have trade barriers or that you put in, or a secular trend in improving the relative attractiveness of taking the right road might be one of the things that actually has an impact on how elites think and what they decide, because ultimately they're looking at what's good for them. And what you're doing is shifting what's good for them. Directly trying to shift their behavior through giving money or trying to decide how to give money, I think you very convincingly point out, probably overrated as a tool in terms of shifting behavior. But maybe this other part, which is everything but aid, if you like, as an agenda for development, is something that we could focus a bit more on. So let me stop with that.
Thank you. That's good. We've gone from everything but arms to everything but aid. Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to hold you off to get some other comments, and then I'll give you time.
Should I put myself in camera as well? Something that's
yeah.
camera here.
Yeah.
Approach here.
Everyone wants to see you.
The jury.
Yeah. Yeah, but Dancing with the Stars, they come and hug the jury.
Don't get carried away here.
All right, so let's open it up. Anybody in the room here with questions? I haven't seen a whole lot on the chat, but you can also insert questions on the chat.
I mean, I haven't read the book. I'm looking forward to it very much. Speak up.
Yeah.
But I'm a historian, and I wanted to present a different narrative. I think of what you're describing, a different narrative, which takes the word neoliberalism seriously. So it's not the development bargain. I think for many people in many historical narratives of how why did countries choose this particular policy mix is suggesting, but rather they were convinced that a certain export-oriented growth model was right, and different countries were convinced at different times. And that, I think, is a narrative that historians at least use, if not the development sector uses, to describe how certain countries ended up in certain places in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. I mean, why do you think it's more useful to talk about development bargain amongst competing elites rather than an ideological consensus around a particular policy mix that has been fermenting since, I don't know, whenever people went up to Mont Pelerin?
Can I take this?
Yeah, why don't you take that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was actually almost going to pass it on to, because in a way, what you were already alluding to now is that, even if you think, and I've made a note on your comment as well, in terms of, that in a lot of these underlying consensuses, and actually take this point entirely, that doesn't define anything in anti-deprivation. Think of China. The first thing was about food security. That was not about growth. That was definitely not about poverty reduction. It was about food security. That was the main occupation. If you think about Senawe, that was in the first instance about agriculture and food security, because that was the embarrassment of under his rule had actually in 2003 and 2002 and 3 actually a drought. They handled it quite well, but they had to ask for help. And they really felt like that's not where I want to be again in this situation. Because the international community was an incredibly effective response, one of the biggest droughts, bigger arguably than the ones we still have, but the biggest that we had, and so on. So there is something there, and that is typically homegrown. That kind of thing is not about my posture in the world. I think, look, and I will admit to them knowledge on Indonesia on that period. I wasn't around. I was very, I was there, definitely not there in terms of getting the sense of it. But you also do get a sense of that. This was pretty stagnant, very poor country then. This was not simply about portraying it. It was, and then maybe it was like, there was a bit of copying in East Asia, Southeast Asia as well. But in the first instance, again, in Indonesia, there's a lot written there about Bulog and the culture marketing board. That was actually always a better model of how to use the state in agriculture than we had seen in African countries. And indeed, we all ended up studying Bulog at the time. And so there is something there that I don't think it is as simple as that, because then, but your argument maybe is there's a copying argument, but the emergence of the garment industry in Bangladesh is not a story of the government deciding to do this. This is still more, I don't know, maybe now we can also put me right on that, but the story that tends to be told is the Dai will try to do it. Was the kind of East Asian investment that came in and actually didn't quite succeed. We withdrew, but there were these other firms coming in. So it's not like, I think June and friends have done us a disservice by always talking about South Korea and this kind of model of industrial policy, that it was all that, that there is heterogeneity in that kind of experience. But yeah, so I would definitely Ethiopia not consider it as all discovered a neoliberal thing. That was definitely not Mel's. In fact, around a lot at the time, he was actually quite against the move into the garment and into the special economic states. He didn't like it. He felt like we should keep on concentrating on the countryside. That was the political economy of it. I remember his advisor I talked a lot about, some people know him, actually kind of really worrying about that Occupy, the other guy that in charge for the Made in Africa book for everything, actually wants to push that. And actually that Meles was dead by the time that was actually becoming a government idea. So you just want to be a little bit, there's a plurality of ideas, let's put it like this.
So I'm Rowan, I work for CGD. I wanted to ask, I guess, through your framework, could you comment a little bit on the fragility of the elite bargain that you talked about? Because you mentioned Ethiopia and Ghana as examples of countries that have achieved an elite bargain that focuses on development. But Ethiopia has recently gone to war with its own people. Yeah. Ghana seems to be headed towards a debt crisis. Yeah. And my mind goes to Zimbabwe, South Africa, plenty of examples of countries that have had for periods of time, really successful development outcomes, and then fallen back into some sort of crony, corruption-oriented state. Why is that the case? Is it simply because international institutions don't offer enough support for those effective, government structures? Is there not enough? I don't know. Is there too much leeway for crony capitalism and opaque financial flows? What breaks down?
Well, I mean, what breaks down Ethiopia, I think Meles and I definitely began, talk forever about the recent history of Ethiopia, but also the whole history of Ethiopia. But ultimately, it's a country that, as economic historians would say, the national question is never resolved. The national question is never resolved. We go back centuries, where this is a complicated country, because this is actually, in the book I also allude to it, is that some people would call it it's the last remaining colonial state in Africa, in the sense that it both colonized the South, created state, Menelik did, and so on. So, I want to be careful to push that out. Sometimes people call it that, but basically, it is a country where the different, they call it the three dominant groups, have been conquering each other for quite a while, and that kind of idea of the nation state never formed well enough. Now, having said that, Meles wanted to have, I think, sought in a particular way. And if in my simple framework, kind of the economic deal had to be delivered, was the way to try to deliver the legitimacy to keep the political deal correctly intact. The political deal was between representatives from the different groups, but the Tigrayans were definitely a dominant force in things. And somehow or another, I was always fragile. We all knew it also as donors. I was very closely involved in the country all the time. I was always very fragile. But somehow, legitimate-seeking behavior counterfactual was better. So political bargaining was always weak, and never got strong enough. And so you get a little bit that essentially, these deals, whether it's these consensus or these bargains here, they can be destabilized, and they were destabilized actually partly by the street, but it was actually one particular group also played into it, as often is with politics, and played into it. And so it was destabilized. And actually, the agency matters. You can really look at Abiy did exactly what the international community asked. These political prisoners, make peace, and so on. And I know I had to, unfortunately, at times pushing government, you need to do this. And it was always a bit like doing it in a big bang. He did it in a big bang, and the big bang. All countries stabilized. Remember when I heard that he had to release prison? It was actually a new line to his life. And we literally both fell out of our chair when we had to do it. This is actually dangerous. This destabilized the case. So there's a lot of management needed. But yeah, so that is actually the fragility of that there. Now, that's the kind of point, I think, is that, you need to keep these things together. And, when I was in Bangladesh, there were actually people worried about can we together. Just move much more through area and so on. But now we move it together, kind of consensus thing. I think, countries in the middle income track, we see the same thing. We need to renew in these elite bargains because there's new rent distribution deals to be done, and we need to find a way of accommodating groups. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question without trying to describe that there's an instability that can be in there, and it's gambles can backfire. And the Ethiopian chapter was the hardest to write because it kept on changing while I was writing. But yeah, you get that in the woods. So yeah.
Can I just come in a bit on that point? Because I think it's really a question, maybe Shanta, you're the right person on this panel to perhaps answer it. In another country, obviously, Sri Lanka, right?
Yeah.
So long time, everybody sees this as having the elite bargainers for growth, and everybody's supporting it. And yet progressively, you start seeing them sort of drift off. And it is again, they start pursuing a set of economic choices about borrowing and about how you invest that people think will get them into trouble, and at some point they do, and things falls apart. Lebanon is another of your examples, Stefan. You know, for 20 years, you say it's a bargain for peace, it comes out of a war, and certainly it was. And yet, look at Lebanon today, you know, majority of the population, if of a middle income country of great broad prosperity is now living in really abject poverty. I think they're falling apart. So I guess the point that Rowan's making, I mean, I want to get a little bit more of this from you guys, is that it seems that it's hard to be able to predict what will trigger the destabilization, you know, and what to do when it starts to happen. And if you have any thoughts on that.
The one thing I would say about Sri Lanka is that actually I am working on this right now,
Yes.
is that both the growth and the human development actually hid a lot of the underlying weaknesses. This elite bargain was actually a very fragile bargain because it lacked two things. One is it lacked accountability. It was systematically geared against accountability. And the second is it didn't empower the poor. It was a true elite bargain in the sense that it served the elites. But Sri Lanka got away with it for so long, partly because they did a few things right, like trade liberalization in the 1970s and started with the human development back in the 1900s, early 20th century. But the other is amazing good luck. You know, every time they had a balance of payments crisis, there'd be some exogenous shock. You know, there was a drought in Kenya, so tea prices shot up, and they got one former vice president for South Asia at the World Bank said, "I'm now convinced God is a Sri Lankan." So I think that was what hit a lot of the.
But can I ask you a question? This is kind of the thing that we don't get at is that, and I want to think more about it, is that, you know, are there examples where that is somehow not the case? But it's slightly differently, that they are, most of these are actually quite fragile. They basically takeoff is described by what you do, a fragility, and then with risks of growth reversal, if you ride the right wave, if you're a bit lucky, you can do a bit better. If you have a conducive, a bit of international community at the right time, a bit of luck that it just fits in something, you can ride the wave. And in other places, it may be because it's inherently fragile. I'm trying to say that because it destabilizes also the politics.
I think it's interesting also that in some of your cases, the elite is comparatively homogenous and also has comparatively close affinity with the masses.
Yeah.
And this is the case, I think, to some extent in Vietnam, certainly in Bangladesh. And you know, you so dramatically resolved the Great Schism in Rwanda after the genocide that these questions no longer arose in the way that they do in Sri Lanka. Lots of There's so much more. Ethiopia is a classic. Indonesia is another one. When I lived in Indonesia, it always used to be a thing of wonder to me that they got any growth. Such an incredibly diverse, fractious conflict. You know, historically, it's amazing that they don't fall apart every day, in my opinion.
Okay. Okay. There's one question in the chat that I thought I would end with because we have to close soon. It's from Stephen Redding. This meaning your talk, seems quite tolerant of perpetuating inequality in developing countries. How does this approach deal with inequality?
You pick the question. Yes. So look, the first thing I would say, I was trying to really look at the kind of takeoff periods things, and in countries at the early stages of takeoff, you know, I would say that the poverty indicators are a better indicator of the nature of inclusion. So I want to actually, if I have a total framework of saying takeoff that actually delivers also some serious poverty reduction. Because GDP of Nigeria is higher than many of the countries that I described, but actually the actual profit is more. So it's the lower end of the distribution. Then next to it, I would say, how do I deal with it and whatever? I mean, the first thing I would actually say is that, and I'm going to get in trouble with some of you, is to, the changes in inequality in societies in terms of income inequality the perception of the change in inequality is far greater than the actual change in inequality. This is the perception in countries. And so the perceptions are there often, and it's often, and for example, during downturns, these perceptions seem to be elevated, and when everything is going good, nobody talks about it. So we know that exactly in Europe as well, when inequality was actually coming down, everybody talked about inequality, when inequality was going up, nobody bothered. And so you have that, I think, in society as well. So if there's growth, actually the level of complaints about the inequality itself is probably less. But it comes back to the conversation we have. During a crisis moment, the fragility of your elite bargain will be affected by the nature of the inequality. And so it's somehow that the stability of the elite bargain, I would make a loose prediction here without the data, but it's like the sense of it, the logic would be that actually in these moments you need to make sure, and that would suggest during good times to work on, because you can't do it easily during the bad times. And so it matters in a kind of political economy sense of the destabilizing force. To be honest, it goes back, isn't it? I've seen earlier papers were alluding to points like that, actually. The early papers on growth and inequality were alluding to that kind of political economy of the instability arguments around inequality rather than.
Okay, well, with those words, I think I want to thank Masood, Ahmed, and Naomi Hossain, and especially Stefan Dercon for a very interesting talk, and for the audience both online and in person. I should say that we had, last time I checked, 97 people online, so that's good. I hope that will help sales.
Yeah, I'll just pick out something like that.
Yeah. So join me in giving Stefan a